Last time, we took a look at need theories of motivation, which tried to explain what motivates people: attention, money, recognition. But today we turn to a bit more complex look at motivation, cognitive or process theories. And those tell us how we're motivated. And in particular, we're going to look at two. First, we're going to start with the notion of equity and how our feelings of being treated fairly propel us to activity. And the second one that we are going to look at is expectancy, and that tells us how our calculations of subjective probabilities of reaching success propel us to activity. Before we even start with looking at some of the formal definitions, I want you to think about times you were treated unfairly. It could be in the workplace, it could be at school, or it could be in commerce when you were buying something and you thought maybe you didn't get a fair shake. Somebody want to say something about that? Perna.
There was a time when I was working for a company and I wanted to work full-time, and I went to the president and told her that I was willing to work full-time, and if the position ever opened up that I would like to fill it. I had all the qualifications, and the next thing I knew, they had an ad in the paper for someone to take that position instead of offering it to me.
So you felt clearly you weren't treated fairly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Emotionally, how did you respond to that?
I was very upset because I've worked for this company for over 4 years.
Did you stay with the company?
No.
Okay.
At that point, I was so upset that I quit.
Okay. So you got out of it. The need to somehow balance the scales of justice, as it were. And that was one of the options open to you. Anybody else have any contributions? Yeah. Francois.
I guess when I went to buy my car, they quoted me at a price, but when I went to handle the paperwork, it turned out to be about maybe $2,500 more than the price that I was quoted at. And again, this is for, expenses which they add on to the car, things that they don't even tell you about. So I went over the price with the gentleman to find out why it was so much. Well, it turns out they gave me things that I didn't ask for. Even though I wanted those things in the car, I was upset that they didn't ask my permission and just assumed that I wanted them. So I acted like I didn't want them, and either he take them off or reduce the price, and he ended up reducing the price.
Okay, so again, you acted in some way to balance the scales of justice. At the point where you were negotiating with him, how did you feel about the fact that they quoted you a price that was a couple thousand higher? What was your emotional reaction to that?
Oh, I was upset.
You were, okay, again upset, and again, the need to do something to get rid of these feelings of upset, anger, whatever it is that we want to label these feelings. So we see then, in two instances here, that these feelings of being treated unfairly clearly do something to move us to action. We've got to get those scales balanced somehow. Okay, having looked at a couple of examples, let's look at a formal definition of equity. Equity theory is a process theory, talks about how, and it focuses on workers' perceptions, I want to underscore perceptions, of the fairness of their work outcomes, which are the rewards that they get, and their inputs, their contributions. Specifically, workers strive, so there is a notion of a drive underneath here, to maintain ratios, and the ratio is the other part that I want to underscore in this, of their own rewards to contributions, which are equal to others. It's one of the things that we have in our mind, kind of a yardstick. Either it's a generalized other to which we compare ourselves, or it's a specific other. And we look at what we're getting out of a situation, what we put into a situation. Okay, so it's relative, it's a ratio, and we compare ourselves to usually comparable workers. and we make judgments, perceptual, about what we think they're getting out of it and they're putting in. And we want to be treated fairly. We want to be treated like other people around us, okay? Sometimes our comparison spreads further. Sometimes it's not local. Sometimes we may compare ourselves to workers in another plant or another company or something like that and how they're getting treated. So we select whom we choose to compare ourselves to. Okay, now let's get to some of the components of this. We need to, before we get to the equation, and there really are equations that underlie all of this, filled with a lot of subjective things, we need to consider two things. This thing called outcomes that I talked about, very important, okay? And I said the outcomes are like the rewards that we get from the situation. So outcomes could include things such as the pay that we get, the vacation time that we get, the other benefits that we get, very tangible kinds of things. It could also include things that are less tangible, the attention that we're getting, the recognition that we're getting. It could include our job assignments. We get particularly peachy types of job assignments, or the schedule that we've been assigned. It could include anything we choose to toss into the pie. Our office, good location. A company car, a company credit card. Other perks that we see come our way. And again, it's perceptual. Anything that we perceive as some kind of outcome is something that we toss into the pie. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is the input. What are our contributions? What do we bring to this? What do we put into the work? Clearly we put in time. And that's fairly measurable. You know how much time you put in and how much time other people are putting in. It's kind of visible. Effort. Well, we know our own effort, and we make judgments about other people's efforts. Less tangible, harder to measure. Does it stop us from making judgments about other people's efforts? Not one iota. We still make judgments. Experience. We think that should count for something. Education. That probably should count for something. And some people may believe that where the degree comes from should count for something. So that a degree from an Ivy League would be worth more than a degree from a state university. Again, perceptual, what people believe is something that they see they're bringing to the table. Skills, knowledge, all of these things can be seen as inputs or contributions to the work situation. And so we build up our own personal equation, probably weighing in most prominently time and effort and experience, what we bring in, and knowledge. Let's put that into it as well. And we weigh that, we look at the ratio of that against what we're getting out of the situation. The position that we hold, our opportunities for advancement, the pay that we're getting. Prominent kinds of things. But again, some of the intangibles go into it as well. Things such as our relationships with our supervisor or coworker, maybe some of the things that we toss in on that side. Okay, and when we compare this to some other or some others, and we make the same kinds of judgments, perceptual about them. Okay, and so we come up with this ratio. Remember, it's not absolute amounts, it's relative amounts. So you could feel as if you're being treated fairly, even though you're comparing yourself to somebody who's making twice as much as you, as long as you think that the person is working twice as hard as you. It's still fair, because it's relative amounts. And it's however you judge the situation. Perception plays a large role. Okay, so the three states then we get out of this. The first is equity. Everything here is equal. Okay, with equity, we see ourselves as being treated fairly, and we're motivated to maintain at least the same level of effort in the situation. Fair treatment. Why slack off? They're treating you well here. But where movement really comes, and we've had that from 2 examples, are those feelings of inequity. The most common feeling of inequity, of being treated unfairly, is underpayment inequity. Our ratio turns out to be less than somebody else's. We're putting in all this effort, and we're not getting the promotion. Not fair. We have all the qualifications for the job. Somebody else gets it. Not fair. And we have a need because when we're treated unfairly, we have real emotional feelings. It arouses emotions. It arouses emotions of anger, where you think you've really been wronged in terms of you put in all this time and all this effort, and suddenly you find out that you're getting paid less than everybody else. Don't like it. Or you find out you're putting in all this time and effort and you're getting paid the same as everybody else, and you're carrying their load. Not fair. Or you find out a new job has been advertised, one that you'd like. They bring in somebody else with that fancy Ivy League degree, and you have to wind up training that person, giving them all your knowledge and all your experience. Not fair. Okay, leaves us feeling upset. I think that's a mild word. Usually the stronger emotion is anger. You can't live with anger. You have to do something about it. So that's one situation, and we'll get to how we can balance the scales in a minute. The other situation is overpayment inequity. Not as common, and very often people don't even feel as if this is being treated unfairly. That's when somebody singles you out as the favorite, and suddenly you're getting treated better than everybody else. But this theory speaks to that as well, because that's a possibility of being treated unfairly. And it sometimes can leave you with feelings of embarrassment or guilt. Why me? Why am I getting all this special attention? I didn't do anything different than anybody else. And how am I going to work with my coworkers? What are they going to think of me when they see me being singled out and getting all this favorable treatment? And they're not getting it. And so, again, there is a drive to try to bring things into balance. But the interesting thing about overpayment inequity doesn't last very long, folks. We get used to it after a while, and we think, hey, I deserve that. And so it begins to feel like equity. So the fact that overpayment inequity is something that organizations need to be as sensitive to and as aware of as underpayment inequity. Okay, balancing up these scales. How are we going to do that? Well, a number of things we can do. Workers can change their inputs. That's something you have control of. We said inputs, well, you can't change your education. Well, yeah, I guess you could go out and get another degree or something like that. Actually, you could change your education. But assuming you're not going to do that, and well, there are 2 things you can change. You can't change your experience. Your experience is your experience. And you can't change your knowledge. You're not going to suddenly get stupid. Well, you might act stupid on the job. That's a possibility, I suppose. You might suddenly not know anything anymore, but really you're not going to change your knowledge. There are 2 things you can change in terms of input. You can change the amount of time that you put in, and you can change the amount of effort you put in. You have both of those under your control. What does it mean in terms of changing time? Well, more absenteeism. Suddenly, that little headache is good reason for taking a day off. Or you don't come back from lunch quite on time. You may not show up for work on time. You may start leaving early. You may start making more phone calls and taking yourself away from work that way. So the amount of time that you're putting in just isn't as much. Or the effort can start to slip. How do you start letting effort slip? Well, the reports that you turn in. not quite as meticulous, not quite as thorough, you're getting them out a lot faster. Why bother? Because other people are doing the same level of reports and getting the same outcomes as you. So those are two things that are under your control, and things do change there. It's a possibility. You don't want to leave the job, or maybe you can't leave the job. So yeah, you can start somehow taking more time for yourself. You can change your outcomes. I guess you could walk into the boss and say, give me a raise. And if you have good arguments on your side, you may even get it. It might happen. As a matter of fact, if we look at things in a macro level, for a while our economy has been chugging along really well, and workers have not been getting their share of the profits that industry has been raking in. But now they are. Wages are going up, folks. We saw a strike take place with United Parcel, and they got a really nice wage increase. So we're going, and they're increasing, interestingly, even more in the non-unionized sector than the unionized sector of the economy right now. So on a grand level, we're looking at righting the thing. Why should industry get all the profits and none of it flow down to the workers who are the people contributing to the profits? It's happening. It couldn't last that wages wouldn't go up, and wages now are going up. So yes, you can increase your outcomes. But if you can't get a raise, what happens? Research on equity theory shows that in some instances, one of the things that workers will do is they'll increase their outcomes in other ways. Pilferage. Things start to disappear. Okay? So yeah, other ways of increasing outcomes. So that's one thing you can do. You could try to change others' inputs or outcomes. That's a little bit harder, getting somebody else to change. But if you have somebody who's really working hard compared to you, you can say, oh, slow down, take it easy. What are you knocking yourself out for? As a matter of fact, if we go way back to where we started at the beginning of the semester, and the Hawthorne studies, again, the rate busters had their inputs changed. They were threatened to have their inputs changed, and they came down. They were pressured not to work so hard. And that does happen in groups, so that particularly where it may be unionized and it's going to look bad for everybody else. That person may come under a lot of group pressure just not to work so hard. Or maybe change the outcomes. You know somebody's really slacking off on the job or doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and you go to talk to the boss about it and see if something can be done to change the outcomes for that worker. Okay, a little bit harder to do. You can always change perceptions. Our perceptions are so malleable. We can change perceptions about our own inputs and outcomes. We can change perceptions about other people's inputs and outcomes. We're not getting what we want out of the situation. We can see other things we're getting out of it that are really valuable to us. Hey, we have a life, and we value that. There are things that we're getting maybe outside the workplace that seem to be valuable to us, and somehow we build that into the equation. To say, all right, maybe we're not getting the promotion, but we've got other things personally that we really value. And we're not getting all the stress that somebody else is getting. And so what do we see somebody else is getting out of the equation? Lots of stress, no time. We change our perception of the other person as well. So yet another way of bringing this equation into balance, but always the drive to do it somehow. Well, what else can we do? We can change who we compare ourselves to. Somebody's a workaholic. Oh, that person's a workaholic. You know, like out of my league. I'm not going to compare myself to that person anymore. And so we find somebody else or some other people we think are really more like us. And we're more comfortable with that. Another way to balance the equation. Either way. Okay? Now, we talked before about overpayment inequity. Okay, you stop comparing yourselves to people who you used to work with, and you start comparing yourselves to people who are getting paid more. And you bring the things back into balance that way. Or finally, when you can't do anything else, you leave. You're out of there. And people quit jobs, as we saw in the experience from Perna today, because the feelings of injustice and unfair treatment are so overwhelming, they can't stay with that organization anymore. It's too bitter, it's too painful, it's too anxiety-producing, and people get out of there. I have to relate a story, dated as it is, but one that I'm always reminded of when I talk about this topic. This goes back to 1986. That was the year the New York Mets won the World Series. The most valuable player on the New York Mets that year was a third baseman by the name of Ray Knight. I don't know what Ray Knight does anymore. He was around managing for a while, but who knows where he is. He wanted an extension on his contract. You know, he was a free agent. He wanted to negotiate a new contract. He was getting on in years. It may have been a career year for him. I think it was a career year for him in retrospect. He desperately wanted 2 more years. And he wanted it, I think, at $1 million a year. Well, $1 million a year these days may not sound like very much considering what players are getting, but at that time, it was a substantial amount. The New York Mets were not going to give him a 2-year contract. They were willing to give him, I believe, 1 year at $800,000. Not a bad deal, but not 2 years. But here he was, most valuable player, that weighed really heavily in the equation, contributing a whole lot. In fact, the Mets had won the World Series. He thought he was worth a lot more than that. So he couldn't stay there anymore. He left. He bolted. He didn't take the 1-year contract. I think he went to the Orioles. Somebody can correct me, but I'm quite sure he went to the Orioles, and for a lot less money. How do you balance that equation? I could have gotten more money if I stayed with the Mets, but it was so bitter I settled for less with the Orioles. Perceptually, he balanced it. He came to terms with it. He said, I'm really appreciated here. It's a lot of appreciation that you put into the equation, but we find some way of psychologically balancing the equation to fit the situations that we're in. Some way we have to do it. So this equity business, as you can understand, really propels you to do something when you feel you're being treated unfairly, usually underpayment, but sometimes overpayment. And I think that employers really do want to treat their workers fairly for the most part. Well, at least I can't think of any admitting to the fact that they wanted to treat them unfairly and exploit them. We have laws against that in the U.S. Fair treatment is a value, a core value in the U.S. So then, what happens? Why do workers feel as if they are slighted so frequently? Well, it could be, if we look at some of the implications of this. Whoops. Okay. That there is what I call creeping inequity. Things happen in the workplace. Wage scales go up. People who were really competent were hired at one wage, and another wage scale comes into place. It could be higher, it could be lower. I'm going to talk about the lower in just a minute. And you have to monitor for these kinds of things in the workplace. There are techniques that you can use to make sure that at least internally, between job positions, in between levels of experience and things that people are contributing, you've got internal equity. And you periodically need to do surveys to make sure that's happening in the workplace. And managers just need to be sensitive to people's perceptions of being treated unfairly in the workplace. It turns out that we are highly sensitive to feelings of inequity. Why? Well, one of the things is that in the US, by and large, pay is secret. It's a norm. We don't go around announcing what we get paid. It's not seen as being polite. And even more so, we don't go around asking people, what are you getting paid? Well, it turns out that in lack of information and knowledge, we tend to think that we're getting underpaid relative to other people. Other people must be making more because I know what I'm making. And this seems pretty low to me. So we tend to think others are getting more. And the other mistake that we often make is that we tend to judge our own efforts as being greater than other people's efforts. Sets up a prime situation for inequity. And that means that managers need to be sensitive to this, and as we'll go on and see with procedural justice, explain the bases on which people get their promotions and increases and outcomes. And to the extent that it's possible, be more open about pay scales. Of course, that would mean if you really opened it up that there may be an awful lot of things that are buried in there that would have to be rationalized by executives that they don't want to unearth. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that people at upper levels of organizations tend to get wage increases above people at lower levels in the organization. Creates feelings of inequity. There needs to be a sensitivity to that. Other reasons for why these things happen in the workplace. Talked about this two-tiered wage system, and that you need to be really cautious about, because one of the things that industry was doing at one point, particularly when it looked like wages were running too high, is they'd negotiate contracts, and unions agreed to this, to have workers come in, new workers would come in at a lower wage scale than existing workers. Well, when they tried that at one of the supermarkets somewhere, they found that the new workers were quitting in large numbers almost as soon as they came in. Because they said, this isn't fair. We're doing the same work as everybody else who was here before us, and yet we're at a lower wage scale. Didn't work. United Airline pilots went on strike because of this in the 1980s. They were afraid of the two-tiered wage system. Ultimately, it's seen as being very unfair. Sometimes people live with it for a while, which says then that ultimately, if you're going to have to make sacrifices in an organization to keep things going, and we've seen that happen. We've seen it happen particularly with downsizing. And we've seen it where wage freezes come into place. We've been through that already in the restructuring. If you're going to ask workers to make sacrifices, you better have everybody equally in the organization make sacrifices. And as soon as it comes out that some people aren't making sacrifices and it makes its way around the grapevine, you have massive feelings of inequity, and you will get lower effort on the part of people, and you surely will get feelings of alienation. And as soon as the opportunity comes, you better believe these workers will be elsewhere, especially the best workers. So management needs to be extremely sensitive to these kinds of issues. There's a second type of unfairness that we need to take a look at in the workplace, and this is called procedural justice. The first part that we talked about was distributive justice, how you get your outcomes or the outcomes that you get. Procedural justice deals with our feelings and perceptions about the process that's used to determine outcomes. It deals with particularly how performance is evaluated, so performance plays a role of this, how pay scales are determined, and how grievances are handled. These are all process issues that we have in the workplace. And we need to be attentive to these things too. Okay, what causes a sense of procedural injustice? What are the things that contribute to it? And how do we build it? To the extent that it's very often it's interpersonal. To the extent that workers are treated without respect, without courtesy, without trust, they feel as if something is wrong in this process. And so they're not going to have a sense of procedural justice. You build it by treating workers with courtesy, a common thing, but they have feelings too, and with respect. So that helps to build it. You give workers a voice in decisions that affect them. They want to have something to say about these decisions that come out that have impact on them. After all, they're going to have to implement a lot of things. They should have something to say about the process. Give them a voice in all of this. in particular, in doing performance appraisals, give them a chance to explain their side of the story. That becomes very important to workers and feeling as if this is a fair process. And finally, explain decisions to workers so that they understand what went into it. And it's not just a capricious, arbitrary decision that you had to make. You're asking somebody to work overtime. Explain why you're asking that person in particular to work overtime so that they understand that went into it. That goes back to, and they all link to each other. Even when workers feel that the outcome itself may not be one that they desire, as long as they've had a chance to say something about it and voice their opinion in their side of the story, at least they feel the process has been fair. You may not like the judgment that's made, but you've got a chance to be heard. In the sense, we all want our day in court to get out our side of the story. So that becomes important in building a sense of justice and fairness in the workplace. Interestingly, all of this process stuff ties to notions of ethics. There are lots of areas in the workplace where there's room for slippage on ethics, where we can cut corners more easily than not cut corners. Ultimately, this is bad because when you start to slip in the ethics area, some people are again going to see things, some people get better treatment than other people. Some people are allowed to get away with things that other people aren't allowed to get away with. Ultimately, this is bad for the business altogether. And it's important then for organizations, if they want to be thought of as up and up organizations, to put policies in place, procedures in place to handle these kinds of issues. What are the particularly touchy areas? Well, conflict of interest areas that might arise in an organization. And you need to be very careful on that. Is it possible that somebody will be seen in hiring as having a conflict of interest? And maybe they should take themselves out of the hiring decision. Well, I mean, yeah, maybe if they're hiring somebody who's a relative, you want to take that person out of the hiring decision because it will be seen as unfair. Okay, which links to what we call nepotism. Nepotism is hiring of relatives. You don't want to say that somebody can't have a position just because that person is a relative. Might make a very good worker, but you don't necessarily want a spouse in on the interview and making the decision, or a parent in on the interview and making the decision. That's a conflict of interest. So you need to be cautious of that. You need to be cautious if you have some organization that you're linked to that you do business with outside the organization, and you're sending contracts that way. People should know that you are a member of that organization, so that's up front, and people don't perceive then that that outside organization you're doing business with, the vendor, is somehow getting a leg up in the situation because of being a relation. Those conflict of interest things need to be out on the table and understood by everybody, because then it has the appearance of being unethical, unfair, and people don't want to work in those kinds of organizations. Not nice to work in that. Equal employment opportunities. You want people to have a sense that they have equal opportunity based on their performance. And it's not based on irrelevant characteristics such as race or gender or ethnic background, whether it is a plus or a minus. Because it leaves you with a lot of people in the workplace who are feeling as if they're getting treated unfairly. So people need to know how those things feed into the situation, and you need to have policies protecting that. Intellectual property policies becoming really a big thing. If you are contributing something to the workplace, you want your patent for it. You want people to know that it belongs to you. Okay, and companies want to know that they're getting a square deal on inventions they've brought to the marketplace. That's why we have patent laws. And we get really incensed, and this is something that we've had trouble negotiating, particularly internationally. We do a fairly good job of this right here in the US. We give performers royalties on things when they perform, and it's used over and over again. We have patent rules. We're quite good on these kinds of things. We have copyright rules. But we deal with countries that don't have these rules. And are they ripping off our things? That's seen as unfair, and we try to now in trade negotiations make sure that's not happening, because things that people have invented here in the US are being used abroad, and they're not getting fair compensation for these kinds of things. So something else we're concerned about. The last thing I want to mention is protection of whistleblower policies. Whistleblowing is all about balancing the scales when people see injustices being done in an organization. And there needs to be, so people feel that they can be open about this kind of thing, protection of these people in the organization. You want to have policies in place so that people can go forward and say, I saw things that were being done that were illegal and in the long run are going to run to the detriment of this organization. I saw bribes being taken. I saw contracts going to people who would have conflict of interest. I saw overcharges being done for work that was never done. All of these things in the long run will come back and hurt the organization. There may be short-term gain, but when it comes out in the open, there is long-term cost. So procedural policies in place to handle ethical issues in the workplace. One of the process theories. The second of the process theories is expectancy theory. This process or cognitive theory states that motivation is determined by the outcomes that people expect as a result of their activities or actions on the job. We're putting something into the situation, okay, and we expect, this is even before we do it, we expect that. We have a future expectation that we're going to get something out of it. And people are motivated to do something when they expect they're going to be able to achieve what they want out of a job. It means that we engage in a lot of mental calculus in all of this, but there are basically three major components to it. The first is expectancy. And this is the belief that efforts will somehow influence performance. If I study really hard, that's the effort, I should be able to answer all of the questions on the exam. That's the performance. If I make X number of phone calls, I should be able to get X number of sales. Performance. Effort, performance. If I train very, very hard, maybe I can sustain running a 10-minute mile. Training, effort, sustaining running a 10-minute mile, performance. Okay? And we make some judgment about the probability of putting in the effort and coming up with a performance. Totally improbable. I could train from now till kingdom come, and I am never going to be able to run that 10-minute mile. Oh, then I won't bother. I think I'll just sit at home and watch TV. Or moderately probable. I think there's a chance that I can do this. I'm going to put some effort into it. I don't know how long it's going to sustain me. We'll see what happens. Or highly probable, this is a no-brainer. I can do that. Okay, in which case I'm going to put the effort in. So that's the first part of it, that effort performance with that subjective probability that we attach to it. The second part of it is instrumentality. And this is the belief, again subjective probability, that the performance is going to lead to some outcome, some desired outcome. If I can answer all of the questions on the exam, I should ace it. I should get an A, desired outcome. If I have X dollars of sales for the month, I should get my commission. X dollars of sales performance, commission or bonus, outcome. If I'm able to sustain running that 10-minute mile for hours and hours and hours, maybe I could finish the marathon and not embarrass myself by coming in after dark. Performance, outcome. Okay, again, what's the probability we attach to this? Can we get that outcome given the performance? Not at all. Not going to get the A. That professor never gives an A. So what's the point? It's not going to matter. Get the commission? Not going to get it. Boss doesn't like me. Won't get it. Yeah, I can sell that amount, but I'm not going to get the commission or the bonus. I'm going to go to some favorite. Be able to, yeah, I can run that amount. Can I, like finish in the top half? Well, everybody else is so much better than me. I'm never going to finish in the top half. Okay, yeah, I can do that, but everybody else is better than me, so it's not going to work. Okay? Or that's no chance at all. So yeah, I can perform at that level, but I can't get the outcome. Why bother? Or yeah, there's a moderate chance I can do it. I think I'm going to put some effort into this. I think I have a shot at it, and it's worth it to me. Or this is what they call a lead pipe cinch. Absolutely, definitely going to happen. So how does this thing work? How does the equation all come together? One more thing we have to talk about, and that's valence. Okay, and that's how much value you attach to the reward or the outcome. Well, it would be nice to finish in the top half, but who really cares? It's not that important after all. Or I really do want that A. I really need that A. I really, really have to have that A. Okay, examples of how much. And this is how the equation works. Okay, again, we don't, in making our decisions about what choices of action we're going to do in all of this, it's not as if we attach specific numbers to this. In research, you do attach specific numbers, so you can predict what courses of action. But for our own purposes, we attach rough numbers of not at all, moderately probable, very likely. Well, it turns out the two factors that lead to this thing called expectancy, as we said before, are effort and performance. So we attach, that's the first probability. If that is 0 in terms of motivation, I'm not going to be motivated. If we think there's no link between our effort and performance, none, or it's really tiny, going to have minuscule motivation. Because remember, this multiplies its way through. The second part, instrumentality, is a link between performance and rewards. Can we get the rewards given the performance? If that's low, 0. Okay? No motivation. Okay? And then we look at the rewards that we get, and we have to multiply it by how much value, valence, we attach to the rewards. Does it really matter to us? In the end, if people are giving us rewards that are insignificant and we don't care about, again, motivation sinks. So all of these things need to be high in order for this thing to work. All of them have to be high. Okay, and some cases, activities we engage in give us negative valence. That is, and sometimes the same activity gives us positive and negative valence. It gets a little complex. I'm going to study, I can get the A. What am I going to lose in the process? I get the A, I really value that. Okay, but there's this fantastic party that's going on this weekend, and it's the only chance I'm going to get to do that. Okay, if I miss that party, I'm going to really miss out on something, and there's always another chance to make up the A anyway. So in terms of choosing things, as you weigh these things out and you attach valence to certain things, valence of one thing may override valence to something else, and it cancels out. So there goes your studying. Everything works, you really would like the A, but there's something you'd really like more that's going to interfere with it, and so that gets fed into the equation as well. We only have motivation so far. We still don't have performance. We need to feed in a couple more things to come up with performance. Things that we talked about from the very beginning when we started talking about motivation. We need to feed in skills and ability, because our motivation level could be up here, and our skills and ability level could be down here. Lots of drive, no ability. Performance isn't going to be in place. We need to then do something to raise the skill and ability level. That's one thing. The other thing is opportunity, motivation level up here, opportunity level, or skills and ability up here, opportunity down there. Still going to interfere with performance. We need to have the opportunity to show what we can do. And finally, we need to think about what affects, how do we get to the numbers that we attach, not possible, moderately, probable, highly probable, to these various subjective probabilities that we come up with? Well, two things feed into that. First is direct experience. We've done it before, so we know if we put in the effort, it's going to work. Or vicarious experience. Other people like us have done it. We could do it. So that feeds into it. Or other people like us haven't done it. We can't do it. Or we've tried and we've failed. Or we've been in the situation where we have performed and we didn't get the outcome that we wanted. We were performing at a really high level. We didn't get the promotion. There are too many people ahead of us. Yes, we can perform, but there's so many people ahead of us in line for promotion. Why bother? I can drop out psychologically until it gets closer in line for promotion to me, while I wait for all these other people who are ahead of me. So implications for managers on all of this. Where does it leave us in terms of what it is that managers need to do, knowing something about expectancy theory? The first thing is the need to clarify expectancies about effort and performance, so that people understand, particularly, what level of effort they're going to have to put into a situation and what's clearly expected from them in terms of performance. This often is not done. You're on a job, you think you know what you're supposed to be doing, nobody tells you what you're supposed to be doing. Comes time for performance appraisal and you don't get the appraisal that you expected because nobody told you where you should be focusing your priorities. You need, as a manager, to be clear with your workers, take out as much ambiguity as possible, and let them know what you expect in terms of intensity of effort and what counts in terms of performance. Clarify that part. Essentially, it says set goals. That's about as clear as you can get. The second thing is, as a manager, help your employees attain the goals. Get from effort to performance and get from performance to outcome. Be a coach. That's one of the roles you're going to have to assume in this situation. Know what kinds of rewards are desired by your employees. What's the point of rewarding them for something that they don't care about? And what has happened in companies as a consequence of this is the movement to what is called cafeteria-style benefits. People at different stages in life want different things in terms of benefits. One size doesn't fit all. Tailor things so that people at different stages are getting what's important to them out of the workplace. Clearly link effort and performance. Link outcomes and performance. Make sure that those two are clearly linked so this thing works. Remember, if anything goes to zero in this, motivation falls. And if workers see people being rewarded for things other than performance, then why work? Maybe all you have to really do is show up. And you get rewarded for showing up and not for the amount of effort that you put in. If that's what people perceive in this, and again, we're dealing with something that's perceptual here as well, then that's what you're going to get. People who show up. They won't perform, but they'll be there. And be sensitive to people's expectancies. Understand, try to get and find out what they think is the expectancy and correct anything, any misperceptions that they have, and also their instrumentalities. Correct any misperceptions in those areas. What it says then as a manager is you've got to know a lot about perception, clearly. But these become useful things in the workplace. Useful when? We really need to ask. When do you use which theory? How do you know to pick and choose as a manager? What's going to be helpful to you? Well, when you're dealing with outcomes in particular, when the focus is on that in a situation, then we're really dealing with need theories. And you have to remember that as a manager, you do have control over outcomes. You have control over the appraisals that people get, an outcome. You have control over the assignments that they get. You have control over the attention that you give them. So, in fact, you have a fair amount of control. Well, you may make recommendations for promotion, but the recommendation has to come from you. And you may make recommendations for bonuses and salary increase, but that's, again, it has to funnel through you. Okay, and at that point, we're really looking more at need side of things. But there are other times when you may be focusing on other kinds of things. So when do the other theories come into play for you in the workplace? Well, we spent probably the bulk of today talking about equity theory, and for good reason. Because of this core value that we have of being treated fairly, and in reality, we're always sensitive to unfair treatment, no matter when. As a manager, your workers are keeping ledgers on you. They're keeping ledgers on you in terms of how much time you're spending with a particular worker versus another worker. And they may even differentiate in terms of quality time. Well, you spend time with me, but only to berate me and tear me down. Okay, I don't count that as time. That's part of the ledger that goes in. They are keeping ledgers in terms of other perks that people get. Somebody got a raise, I didn't get a raise. Somebody got tickets, you had tickets to the Jets game, and you offered them to another worker before you offered them to me, and you know I love football. How could you do that? How could you treat me so unfairly? The person doesn't even really care about football. That's another part of the ledger. So that's always going on, and you need to monitor yourself and monitor your employees to see what's going on. But sometimes it is particularly salient. And when does it come up as particularly salient? When comparisons are being made. And when are comparisons being made in the workplace? Well, they get made about the time that appraisals are done. Because when you're doing appraisals, what you're doing either consciously or unconsciously is comparing workers to other workers. So it certainly comes up around that time. It comes up around the time that increases are given. People are going to be comparing themselves to other people. So it will be particularly salient and in people's minds at that point. And you need to be conscious and aware of what's going on and tie it all to procedural justice, because you as a manager, you like to treat people fairly. And you think you're treating people fairly, and you know why you're coming up with the decisions that you are coming up with. So in your mind, everything's fair. But unless you explain that to the workers, they don't know. And so they may think you're behaving in a way that is arbitrary, capricious, and so they don't like it. So take the time at this point to explain the various decisions so that it has the appearance, the perception, as we talked about, of fairness. People know what the rules are. Expectancy theory, when does that come into play in the organization? Well, it's particularly salient at the time that we do goal setting with workers. And now you need to think about, and we'll talk about goal setting next time. But when you are setting goals, you are setting performance standards for people to reach. And they're going to think about, how much effort am I going to have to put in to reach these standards? Is somebody asking something of me that I can't possibly reach? It's way beyond what I can do. This is crazy. And so they'll come up with notions that I can't do it. If you think your employee can do it, then again, explain to your employee why you think the person can do it, and explain the resources that you're going to give, and encourage them. Be the coach. Let them know that you have every expectation and why you have the expectation that they'll be capable of doing this. You're asking for a stretch in terms of skills. Somebody hasn't tried this before, but they have done something similar and pointed out to them in their background so that they understand that they have a similar type of experience, or somebody else who's similar to them has done it. So they get the feeling that they can reach that goal that you're setting. That's one point. The next point in all of this, in goal setting, is again with, outcomes. If you perform at this level, you tell people that, if you're really clear, you will get the promotion, you will get this kind of assignment. Okay, and then you have to back that up. So at that point, expectancy theory becomes very, very salient. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with going on next time and taking a look at some very specific ways where programs have been used to engage motivation. The ones that we're particularly going to look at is job design. How can we design the work so that the work itself becomes exciting for people to do and gets them interested in it, and they're motivated just to come to work because the work is fun. Or performance appraisal. Can we use this in such a way so that people don't feel punished by it, but it raises their level of expectancies? And finally, that old thing, pay. Does pay work? Do we work harder when we get paid more? Is there any way that we can use pay more effectively? It is the most common reward that's out there. From the employer's perspective, are they getting the bang for all the bucks that they're paying? So this is where we're going to go next time.